Hi, my name is Rory, and in this demonstration I'm going to show some additions we've made to the emulation support in iTest 3.5. So I have here a simple test case with some SSH steps, and if I select the emulation properties for show version command, for example, then what we see is that the emulation properties now allow us to select where the emulation source will come from. That is, where does the simulated emulation response come from? So what we used to have was, in iTest 3.4, was we could specify the response to emulate a given step using the properties for each step itself. So you can use latest and then edit that and emulate the step, and that's what it will use. But we found that we have, in the response maps, we already have the information we need to be able to emulate steps. So, for example, if you look at this show version response map, if I look at the samples, we've already got the response in this response map, and we also have the additional information in there that we've now support under the advanced editing button. Section rather, and this shows that what we have in the response map for each sample is the response as well as all the extra information that we need to be able to emulate a step. So I'll come back to this, but first of all I want to show that if we select this sample in this response map, that we can emulate with this response. So if I go back to a test case and select use external source, which is selected by default, and select this response map, I can do that by either saying use the response map library, and then I can select that library and it'll use the normal applicability rules for the command to find the appropriate response map within this library. Or if I know the response map name and I want to go straight to it without using applicability rules, then I can specify an individual response map directly. And if I press OK and say that I want to emulate this step, what will happen when I execute this test case now is it will emulate this one step and get its emulation response from the first sample in the show version library. If I want to, I can specify a different sample name, but I'll just execute it with the default sample name for now. Right, now, so we can see that it emulated the show version step, and if I look at the response, I haven't customized the response yet, so you just get the response from the response map, but it's hard to tell where it came from. So you can look at the structure view, and in here we have an element which is the emulated source, and that shows the response map name and the sample name that the emulated response came from. And for example, if I emulate the same test case and emulate another step with the local response, just so you can see the difference. So if I go use latest and I want to emulate this step as well, and then select this radio button here to use the step response. So another shortcut for getting to edit the step response is this link here that we provided. It does the same thing as clicking on that link there. And now if I emulate this test case, we'll see that the other step came from the local emulation response instead. So let's look at the structure. What's the easiest way to show this? Yeah, there. It's already selected. So that's right. So for the show version step, we have the emulation source as the response map sample, and for the ping command, I temporarily said I wanted to use a local emulation response, and it's got the source from the step itself, the step properties. Now, if I want to emulate all of the steps in a session, and I would like all of the emulation responses to come from the response map library, the easiest way to do that, if I start from scratch, is just I'll clear the emulation properties that I've customized so far in this test case. So we're back to where we started. And now, if I go to the session profile, I can select in the miscellaneous page, I can select the emulation source and to be a response map library. So if I select lib1, where I happen to have some response maps for the steps in this test case, save that, and then execute this test case, emulate all of the steps in the session. So the quickest way to do that is from the emulation menu. And execute. And now what's happened is that we have emulated all of the steps in this session, and if we look at the structure, it shows us where the emulation response came from for all of the steps in the session. So you see here that the response came from the response map library for the appropriate command for each step. And for steps that don't have a response, an applicable response in the response map library, we default to using the local emulation step response. So here, for example, I didn't provide a response map library for the open or the close step, so it used the emulation step response, and if I'd wanted to, I could have customized those properties for the step. It's only really necessary to provide an emulation response for steps that have analysis rules on them, so typically it will just be the command steps in an SSH session. Another place I can specify default emulation source is if I can do it first of all from the session profile for a session, but another place I could do it is in the testbed properties for a given device. So if I select that same device here and go to the libraries page, you'll see the equivalent properties, and it inherits from the session profile by default, and I can override that if I want to select a different response map library. I'll just leave it as it is for now. So just to summarize that briefly, if I go back to the emulation properties for the show version command, for example, what I forgot to mention was that when this property here is blank, it automatically inherits that external source from the current session, which can be the testbed, can be set in the testbed or the session profile. And in the case of when a response map library is specified, if there is no applicable response map in the library, then rather than giving an error, we automatically fall back to using the emulation properties for this step response instead. So if for a given step you don't have a response map in a library, and you've selected to use a response map library, then that's equivalent to having this checked instead. Now, just to go back to the response map editor, I've shown so far just the default values that we have in here. So this is a sample that was added just by storing a response from a previous execution, creating a response map from a previous step response, and I want to show that you can easily add new samples and customize them. So for example, if I go Control-C on that sample and then paste that in and create a new sample name. Now I can edit this to have whatever response I want. So let's say, for example, for this one, I'll change the version to 12.3, and I might add some structured data. This is for showing how you can use response maps to provide responses that your current testbed might not provide. So if I go demo, for example, so just to show the rest of the properties in the response in the advanced section clearly, if I want to customize a response so that it will no longer map according to the response map, then I can check the do not map this sample. And just like for emulation, the emulation properties, I can select different content type like XML, etc. I can customize the structured data that comes from an application. This has had the mapping and everything stripped out of it. And we can also simulate the duration. So by default, this shows how long it took to actually execute the show version command last time this was executed. And before I select this sample for emulation, it's worth just showing that while I've customized the response and the structured data, it actually is shown in the current response and structure views. So it's a live view of those values. So the queries are updated according to the current response mapping, and you see here there's the new element that I added, simple data, simple value to the structured data. And if I wanted to, I could add a custom query that would map to my customized structured data, and that all works fine. So now I've added a second sample to the show version response map library. I can go back to my test case, and if I take this existing step here, that now we're emulating the whole session and we're getting our response maps from this library, all I need to customize is the sample name. And when I emulate that, that will show, in this case, the new version that I put in there. So if I customize the analysis rule to look for the new value that we're expecting and execute this test, you see here that it got that the value was version 12.3. And if I go back to show the structure for the response, then we will see that the emulated data came from sample 2 instead of sample 1, just here. So that shows that you can copy and paste existing samples and select those as your emulation source. So you can have as many samples as you like in a response map, and going back to the emulation properties for the test case, you can have the sample name to be any of those samples in the response map, or if you check this icon here, then this can be a $var, which could be a sample name, for example. So dollar sample name, and you can have that substituted at runtime. So you could have a for loop where each time through the loop, for example, if you update that variable, you can select a different sample at runtime to iterate through a whole sequence of different responses. Apart from copy and pasting responses, the easiest way to add responses to an existing response map library is from the response view. If you have, you can open any previous test case, for example, and go to a given step in that response, and then just select the response view, and then use these two icons here. So you can, by checking that, you can add the sample to an existing response map, or you might store it in the new response map. And if you have multiple response maps for the same command, you can give it a lower priority if you want to only use a given response map for emulation instead of for response mapping. It's worth mentioning some of the error handling for this emulation support. If you specify a sample name in an emulation library that doesn't exist, like sample 3 in this case, and then execute, it's going to give you an error because you've specified a sample name that can't be found in the library. And you can customize the error event handling if you want to by looking at the new events that we've defined for emulation. So we have 3 error events for emulation now. Oops. So the first one is, well, actually the simplest one to talk about first is if you specify a response map that's not found, then we'll give an error. Similarly, if you specify a response map that is found but the sample name is not found, then we give an error. And this one is needed for substitution if you end up with invalid structured data after substitution. It's worth mentioning while I think about substitution that we support substitution for the emulation properties. So for example, if you have the step emulation responses, then you can check these little grey icons here to enable substitution for the response or structured data, etc. in here. And similarly, in the response map, you can check the little grey icons to enable field replacements at runtime. Just to show that briefly, I've got a, oops, wrong test case. I have a test case here that has defined a little snippet of structured data in the variable S1, and if I go to show version and add a sample for substitution, and use, let's see, if I replace this with our variable, and I have to enable field replacements for this property, and save the test case. Go back to the test case and select that sample. And just to vary the experiment a bit, I'm editing the wrong test case. Okay, I'll just quickly flip over here. I was going to say that in this case I've used the device to specify the session, and we're using the inherited emulation source that comes from the session profile to select the response map library. So now back to this step. Now if I do it for the show version step, which is where I planned it, and select the correct property. Now if I emulate this, if I execute this test case, Okay, that did not emulate because I forgot to enable emulation. So now I'll go back and emulate this test case. So now I have emulated with a different sample, and you can see that the query failed because I got a different response this time. No, the query failed because I was checking for 12.2 and I emulated with 12.3. But the main point that I wanted to show here is that with substitution enabled, it has substituted the value $s in the test case. So let's just briefly go back to that test case. So I set S1 to S1 sample data, and then I put $s1 into the structured data for substituted sample in this show version response map. And then when I emulated with that response map, you see the structured data down here shows that the substitution worked and that we have the expected value in the structured data. So now I've shown emulating steps with their responses coming from response map libraries by selecting the external source to come from, in this case, the lib1. And if you want to, you can have lots of different response map libraries. For example, you might have an emulation library that can be chained to a normal response map library, and in that emulation library you can specify unusual responses if you want to, and because it's chained, then it would automatically follow on to the chained response map library to get the rest of the responses. And that's the end of this demonstration.